Today, we get to move into chapter 4 of the human condition. I'm of the opinion that this is one of the most important chapters, and one that's really worth paying a lot of attention to. It's short, shorter than both labor and action, but especially important. And that is true, especially given the kind of focus that we've had in the last couple of meetings on the importance of the idea of a world for Hannah Arendt. And so I want you to, as you go through this chapter, really pay attention to the idea of world. The payoff of the chapter, where it really comes to make its most sense, is in section 23, which we'll talk about next meeting, where Hannah Arendt talks about the work of art. And so something to keep in mind as we talk about this is that the highest manifestation of work, and thus the most worldly work, is the artwork. And we can then also say that within artworks, there's also a hierarchy. And the essence of work and what makes work so important is that it's durable and that it lasts. And thus it creates or helps populate a shared world that unites people who are otherwise singular, plural, and different. And if you think about it in that sense, all works degrade, temples degrade, artworks degrade, but the works that are most lasting for Hannah Arendt are stories. And so stories are the highest and most worldly and most durable form of work. And thus the poet or the historian, the teller of stories, is for Arendt the highest manifestation of a worker and of work. So with that sort of basic introduction in mind, I guess I'll say one other introductory idea, which is that we should remember that the chapter on work is the second of 3 chapters in the middle of this book on the human condition, in which Arendt is articulating 3 conditions of what it means to be human, as being human has emerged over the last few thousand years. They're not human nature. It's not something that is part of a genetic, natural idea of man, but they're 3 activities of man that have come to condition what it means to be human in the history of our people in the last few thousand years. And they're all part of the vita activa, thus the inversion of an older idea in which contemplation was higher than activity. And the history of the last 2,000 years since the Greeks has been the inversion of that, so that the vita activa transcends the vita contemplativa, and action replaces contemplation as the highest idea of human life. There's a second inversion in that, which is that while for most of the last 2,000 years, work and action have been thought to be higher than labor, which was seen as privative, labor which was seen as necessary, Arendt is going to argue that in the modern era, and the modern era begins largely in the 17th century with the scientific revolution, which we'll start to get to today, we see the vita laborans, the anima laborans, the idea of labor, elevating itself over both action and work. And so you should be paying attention to the way in which that's happening as well. And that will be something we talk about throughout this chapter, and then talk about quite a lot in the very end of the book in section 42, 43, and 44. So in many ways, these chapters are super important to understand the end of the book, And so we're going to I hope, have a productive conversation about them. Chapter 18, the first chapter on work, simply tries to set out the basic ideas of what work is and how it's distinguished on the one hand from labor and on the other hand from action. The key word here is durability, and it's not an accident, and it's the durability of the world, which is the title of chapter 18. These titles, I hope we're figuring out, are important. She puts the main idea in the title, and we have to try and understand that. But if you look at the first few pages, durability and stability and solidity are used over and over again in these pages. The key idea is that when we labor, we create products of consumption that we consume, and the core example of labor is bread, right, or food. You labor, you make food, you eat it. That food largely disappears, and it doesn't have a lasting impact on the world. It's not an object, and she uses object in the traditional Latin meaning of object, objectum, to throw against, which in German is the same, Gegenstand, to stand against. An object is what we create through the work of our hands that stands against us, that becomes a thing in the world that we interact with on a lasting and durable level. So there are numerous examples of objects, of things, of work. One is a table, and you can imagine a table that you sit around for dinner every night with your family, or you sit around weekly with your students, and that table becomes not just something you consume, although it will eventually die and go back to being wood or decompose, but it becomes something around which memories form. It becomes an object that orients our class and our world, its shape, its feeling, the way we rub our hands along it when we're thinking. The table comes to serve a purpose. And if it's a particularly nice table, we may hand it down to our children when they start their own house, and they will remember growing up with that table. And the table thus has a kind of durability that creates a world that, even though our children are different than us and they may eat, pasta every night, whereas we ate steak, or they may, eat kale, whereas we used to eat potatoes, something about the table unites us and keeps us in a common world. And that's the truth with family heirlooms, with a family house. It's a pocket watch that you inherit from your grandfather. It's things that are durable and lasting. And as I said, the things that are most durable and most lasting are artworks, things that we really do try and preserve and we don't use up, and that have no other use except to be things we look at or recite, poetry or stories. And in reciting them, we don't have a use except that they help create a common world that unites us amongst our differences. And so what work is the activity of artificing, making, fabricating objects, Gegenstands, things that stand against us, that persist and are stable in the world over a long period of time. And in such working and lasting, help create a kind of common world. You can see the importance of work for politics in that sense, because what work does is make us political, in the sense that it gives us something common that unites different people into a common people. I should say, and I think this is important, and I think I've said it, these distinctions of work, labor, and action are blurred. They're not supposed to be like, the point is not to say this is work and that's labor and that's action. They're all blurred so that there are something like a meal, which is, of course, consumption because it's going to be eaten, can become a kind of work if it, creates if we take a picture of it or if we hold on to it and it becomes a kind of memory. And it also becomes an action. It's something we do that we could then tell stories about, and that meal will last over time. And so these are flexible categories. The point is not to make them, the point is not to sort of make rigid distinctions, but to see the importance of what she's saying as different aspects of these activities. Laboring is when we make something work for something in which the end product is not important, because the end product is going to be consumed. It's gonna die. It's going to be consumed. It's not going to last. Whereas work is an activity in which we make something in which the end product is going to last. Thus, labor is, as we talked about the last few classes or meetings, I apologize, is a cycle. We labor, we produce, we consume, we labor, we produce, consume with no end. Whereas work has a beginning point. We think of something we want to create, whether it's a table or artwork, and we create it. And then we have the thing. And while the thing may eventually decay or disappear, it will last. And that lastingness of the thing is what separates it from a product of labor. So chapter 19 is on reification. Reification is a word that many people use. It's a complicated word, but let me just tell you what it means. It comes from res. Res in Latin means thing. And so if you want to think of a good translation of it, it means thingification. It means to thingify. And the point here is that the essence of work is that it creates things that are in the world, the thing in the world. And it does so through violence, right? This is where Raphael was asking his question from. She says, this element of violation and violence is present in all fabrication. And fabrication is reification. It's the creating of solid things in the world. There's an interesting distinction she makes at the bottom of this page, going on to the next page in the footnote 3, which is that when humans create things, make things, there's a difference between what she calls medieval thingification, creating, in which we create things, but we do so sort of in this creative sense where we take things that are given to us and we create things from them. But we are sort of dependent upon a plan beyond ourselves, God's plan, nature's plan, etc. Versus what she calls the modern practice of reification or thingification, in which we think of ourselves as able to take the world and remake it and make things not in line with God's laws, but within our own laws. And we become Lord and master of the earth. And that's one key distinction within the idea of thingification that she is talking about. Another important distinction in this section is she wants to say that in reification or thingification, and thus in work, we always begin with a model, with a guide outside of our head. This is not purely subjective. We have an idea of making a bed or a table, and we have that idea because of an idea outside of us. This is to go back to Plato, the ideas. We don't sort of just, it doesn't come from our subjective brain. It comes from something in the world. We have beds because the world needs beds. Now, obviously, that had to start somewhere, but she says that, whenever we create things to a large extent, and I think even to a full extent, there's a communal need, there's ideas, there's common drives, models that are outside of our subjective experience. The importance of this is that the bed may eventually break and need to be thrown out, but it's a bed, and the idea of a bed lasts. And so even more durable and lasting than the bed or the table are the ideas of the bed and the table, which creates a lasting common idea of the world. So that work is based on actually a common background. So chapter 20 is called Instrumentality and Animal Laborans, the laboring animal. So instrumentality here is an important word. On the one hand, humans who make something, right? Homo faber, fabricating man, artificing man, the man who makes the artificial world, the world that lasts, the durable world, and thus the world that unites plural and unique individuals, relies on tools, right? You make things, whether it's a table, you need tools. And if you're even going to make an artwork, you need paintbrushes. And if you need stories, you need words. You need tools to make anything. So she says on 144, we're going to do a little more reading here because here things get quite interesting and important. About 8 lines into the chapter. Tools and instruments are so intensely worldly objects that we can classify whole civilizations using them as criteria. Right? So we have the Bronze Age, that's what she's thinking of, the Iron Age, the Machine Age, things of that sort. Tools not only last, right, picks and axes and things, but determine the kind of things we make in the world, so that tools really do influence and help create different kinds of worlds. Then she continues, nowhere, however, is there a worldly character more manifest than when they are used in the labor process, where they are indeed the only tangible things that survive both the labor and consumption process itself. So, I mean, again, let's use our basic example of labor, making bread. When we're done making bread, the bread is gone, we eat it, but the oven or the bread pan or the mixer or whatever it is we use survives. So therefore, for the animal laborans, the laborer, which is subject to and constantly occupied with the devouring processes of life, the durability and stability of the world are primarily represented in the tools and instruments it uses. I think it's fairly simple. The laborer, keeps, the baker uses the same rolling pin, etc., and that's what, in a sense, keeps his world stable. It's not the bread he or she makes. The second step that she wants to make on page 145 is to say that in laboring, there's a loss of distinction between means and ends, right? When you make the bread is not an end so far as it's to be consumed. It's what? It's a means for life. And insofar as the bread becomes a means for life, there's not a distinction between means and ends. As we've said over and over again, the laboring is a cyclical process. And there's a second thing she wants to add to this now at the bottom of this page and in footnote 8, which is that in laboring as a result of that, the tools we use are in a sense outside, lose the character of being outside of man. So what does that mean? To the extent, let's think about baking for a sec. When you're rolling the baking pin, right? And you go like this and this and this, the baking pin, in a sense, or when you're stirring it and you're doing this, to the extent you get a rhythm going and you get going and you start singing a song, right? You sort of meld together almost with your tool. And there's what she calls a rhythmic unification of the laboring body with its elements. And the more the more quintessential your labor, the more rhythmic it is, the more you, in a sense, lose the distinction between tool and your hands or your body. And the tools, in a sense, disappear as separate. And she has this footnote about labor songs and works, and how there's this that in real labor, you sort of want to lose the connection with the outside world, and you want to become at one with your laboring. And that in laboring, you sort of lose your attention. You become sort of in a spiritual trance. And she cites these labor theorists of the 19th century, Karl Bücher and others, who are saying this is why labor is sort of spiritual and why it's so great, because in labor we lose ourselves. And she's saying, not so much. This is not such a good thing. In a sense, it demands less attention, and thus it's less human and more a reduction of human work to the kind of laboring body. So what she then says next, beginning on page 147 with the paragraph, the decisive difference between tools and machines, right? This is really where things start getting super interesting. She wants to make a distinction between tools on the one hand, which she calls tools of workmanship. And in tools of workmanship, the work remains the servant of the hands. Okay, what does that mean? Well, when I build a table, I'm thinking there's an idea of the table, or I know I want a table, and I tell my hands to build the wood, cut down the tree, do violence to it, saw it, do violence to it, and make a table. So the work remains the servant of my hands and my head. But when I start working with machines, Arendt says, I often can become a servant of the machine. I adjust to the machine. Now, there's going to be different levels of this argument that she wants to make, because on one hand, we also adjust to the saw. And if I use a dull saw or a sharp saw or an electric saw, my work is going to be different, and I adjust to them. But she's going to make an argument that there is a real difference between the adjustment to non-machine-like tools and the adjustment to mechanical machine-like tools. So what is that? On the bottom of 147, she says, as is so frequently the case with historical developments, it seems as though the actual implications of technology, that is, the replacement of tools and implements with machinery, have come to light only in its last stage with the advent of automation. So now what she's going to do on pages 148 to 150 is tell a story a 3-stage story of the stages of technology. And so I just want to outline these 3 stages. The first one is the stage of technology understood as the steam engine. These are all modern technologies. The steam engine takes natural processes, namely the fact that water can turn a wheel, and imitates it. And instead of water, uses steam, which has advantages because you don't need to bring an ocean into the boat or an ocean into the train or a river. You can do it through steam and through a machine that's more portable and useful. And so these machines imitate natural processes. And they're simply increase the power that we would have with our hand turning a wheel. In one sense. The second stage is the stage of electricity, in which the thing about electricity is that it's not natural, right? We have lightning, right? But the electricity creates something in which we're not just enlarging our ability to turn a wheel with water or with steam. We're actually creating something that nature doesn't have, which is electricity in the sense of electricity that comes out of an outlet or can be harnessed in this way. We actually have to change the water or the coal or the oil or the natural gas or the sunlight into something that's never existed before, right? This kind of electric current. And so we denaturalize nature for our own worldly ends. And in doing so, and here's the important step on this level at the bottom of 148, today we have begun to, and it's in quotes, create, as it were. That is to unchain natural processes of our own. To unchain natural processes of our own. We create something like electricity. And in creating something like electricity, which really was not a thing in the world before, becomes a process that will have a kind of infinite and uncontrollable outcomes. Things will emerge in the world, right, that would never have emerged simply through nature and without us. I mean, this thing we're talking through, a computer, is just not possible without electricity. And it is in some ways part of a process we created with the creation of electricity that simply could not have ever existed without electricity, and many other things. And so what she says is, instead of carefully surrounding the human artifice with defenses against nature's elementary forces, keeping them as far as possible outside of the man-made world, we have channeled these forces along with their elementary power into the world itself. The result has been a veritable revolution in the concept of fabrication. Manufacturing, which always had been a series of separate steps, has become a continuous process. You had to cut down the tree, you had to, sand it, you had to do this, you had to do that, cut it, make the thing. Now it's on a conveyor belt, it's electric, and it sort of goes. And in fact, what's the end stage of this? Well, we simply create one machine that will do what? Cut the tree, sand the tree, make the table. And this gives rise to the third stage of modern technology, which is automation. And this is where things get interesting for Arendt, really interesting. Automation, she says on 149, is the most recent stage of the development, and it illuminates the whole history of machinism. She's quoting the book from Friedman here, but the main work she's here using is a work by John Diebold, Automation and the Advent of the Automatic Factory. But the point is that with the rise of automation, and with automation, we now have to, 70 years after she wrote this book, or 65 years after she wrote this book, we have to add in artificial intelligence, right? Which is what she's really getting at and talking about with automation. We come to see what the whole machine age was actually heading towards. The whole machine age was heading towards, as she says, the culminating point of the modern development is a situation in which fabrication is a continuous process. As she says on the footnote 12, the assembly line is the result of the concept of manufacturing as a continuous process. And automation, one may add, is the result of the machination of the assembly line. To the release of human labor power in the earlier stage of industrialization, right, in like the steam engine where we increase labor power, automation adds the release of human brain power. Because, quote, the monitoring and control tasks now humanly performed will be done by machines, right? This is what we're currently experiencing really right now. We're not just replacing physical labor with machines. We're also replacing intellectual labor with machines, whether it's advanced stock trading or whether it's quality control in factories, right? We don't even trust a human to test a Coke bottle or a pen to see if it's made well and if it's safe or it explode. We have machines do it because machines are more reliable. They don't get sick. They don't get tired. They don't have a bad day. They don't let one go by because they just like feeling like it. And machines are better at actually not only doing physical labor, but actually doing the kind of brain work that traditionally humans, even in the earlier machine age, were thought to be human. The result of this for Arendt is that there's no respect left in labor and in factory work. The worker has simply become a kind of physical body who really does nothing unique and nothing that can't in the end be replaced by a machine. This is, of course, some of you are following many of these developments in the world today. This is what's happening. We're replacing, some of the most interesting examples of this are the IBM computer Watson, which is, really going to replace something that we often thought was irreplaceable, which is not only the doctor as surgeon, which is already happening. You're starting to have computers do surgery. And even when doctors do surgery now, they often do it with a joystick. And the advantage of using the joystick with LASIK surgery and others is that since you have to do very precise movements, if whatever happens, you sneeze or you make a bigger movement than you're supposed to, the computer corrects your movement, right? So we actually use computers to prevent mistakes by humans. But even in things like babysitting and childcare and teaching, we are in a very quick pace experimenting with robot nannies and robot caregivers. And I gave a one-day university lecture about 2 or 3 months ago on a number of these new companies and new robots that are being tested right now, which many people think do a better job of securing the safety, but also the well-being and intellectual and moral development of children than babysitters. And they're going to end up being cheaper, more reliable, and so you're going to have children, at least in the poorer areas of the world, relying on machines to raise children. And what that means for how these children will grow up, whether they will be human or something else. Well, they'll be human in a human sense, in a natural sense, but the condition in which they grow up will change dramatically. So Arendt is talking about this transformation and the rise of automation.